All right, welcome to lecture 2. Now let's slow down and take this step by step. Up to this point, we've been talking about the human problem and God's redemptive plan, especially through the writings of Paul. We talked about sin and grace and the cross. Now we move into a space where things get much more complex because we're dealing with two massive religious traditions that both claim to speak for God, both claim to honor Jesus, and both claim to offer a meaningful path to salvation. Here's the thing. Once you get past the shared words and the familiar names, the differences don't stay small. They become structural. That's why this lecture isn't just asking, what do Christians and Muslims believe about Jesus? You already know the basic answers to that. Instead, we're asking something more precise and more revealing. How does the Quran actually shape its picture of Jesus? How does it tell his story? How does it limit his role? And why does it do that consistently, even though when it affirms things like that sound very close to Christianity? We need help, not from polemics and not from surface comparisons, but from the tools that let us read the Quran carefully and honestly. The two scholars are especially useful, Andy Bannister and Mark Durie, both of which have had a profound influence on me. They do very different things, but together they give us a clearer picture of what's going on. Let me set the scene here. The Quran enters a world that is already full of religious stories. Late antiquity was noisy. Religious speaking, biblical narratives were everywhere. Jewish ideas about judgment and the angels and the end of the age circulated. Christian preaching shaped cities, villages, and trade routes. And stories about Jesus were not located inside the four Gospels the way modern readers can imagine. For many people, Jesus was not first encountered through a book. He was encountered through stories that were heard. Stories passed down orally, stories shaped by the community memory, and stories shaped by worship and preaching. That matters because the Quran presents itself first and foremost as a recitation, something spoken, something heard, something remembered, and something repeated. This is where Andy Bannister's work becomes especially important. Bannister argues that the Quran should be read primarily as an oral text. That doesn't mean it isn't written down, it means its structure, rhythm, and repetition make sense when you imagine it being delivered to a listening audience, not silently read like a modern book. In oral cultures, repetition is not filler. It's how meaning is fixed. It's how boundaries are protected. It's how listeners are guided toward the right conclusions. So when modern readers say, why does the Quran keep saying the same thing? Bannister's answer is simple because that's how oral proclamation works. Once you start listening that way, something becomes very clear in the Quran's treatment of Jesus. The Quran is willing to say impressive things about him, very impressive things: virgin birth, miracles, moral purity, prophetic authority. None of that is minimized, but, and this is crucial, every affirmation is carefully framed so it never leaves where Christianity goes. Over and over again, the listener is reminded that Jesus acts only by God's permission. He heals by God's permission. He raises the dead by God's permission. He performs signs by God's permission. This repetition functions like a guardrail. It keeps the audience from drawing conclusions that would violate the Quran's core commitment to divine oneness. So Jesus can be extraordinary without being divine. He can be honored without being worshipped. He can be miraculous without being the source of salvation. In the Quran, Jesus consistently functions as a sign. He points away from himself. The miracle doesn't tell you who Jesus is, he tells you who God is. The story may sound familiar to Christians, but the meaning has been redirected. Now, Mark Durie helps to push this insight even further. Understand how the Quran communicates, Durie helps us understand what the Quran is doing theologically. Durie's concept of reflexive revelation argues that the Quran develops an active conversation with the religious ideas around it, especially Jewish and Christian ones. In this view, the Quran is not simply adding revelation on top of previous revelation, it's actually correcting, redefining, and replacing earlier theological claims. This becomes especially clear in the Quran's treatment of Jesus. The Quran does not reject Jesus, it honors him, but it consistently refuses the claims Christianity say are non-negotiable. There is no incarnation, no divine sonship, no atoning death, no resurrection that vindicates Jesus as Lord. What Christians see as the heart of salvation, the Quran sees as theological error. Durie argues that this is not accidental, it's deliberate repositioning. The Quran preserves enough overlap to sound familiar, but it redefines the meaning so the apostolic witness no longer sets the terms. Nowhere is this move more obvious than Quran's denial of the crucifixion. For Christians, the cross is where God deals with sin, justice, mercy, and reconciliation. Remove the cross, and the entire Christian story collapses. Durie argues that rejecting the crucifixion functions as a theological veto. It blocks the idea that God would save through suffering and self-giving love. Jesus must be protected from humiliation because divine transcendence must be protected at all costs. Durie also traces how the Quran's tone and focus shift over time as Muhammad's role changes. Every passage emphasized proclamation and warning. Later passages sharpened boundaries, consolidate authority, and divide the community more tightly. Classic Islamic theology explains this through divine wisdom. Durie reads it as adaptive development, revelation responding to historical pressure. When you put Bannister and Durie together, the picture becomes clear. The Quranic Jesus is not a partial version of the Christian Christ. He is a re-narrated figure, shaped to serve a different vision of God, revelation, and salvation. Bannister shows how repetition stabilizes the vision in communal memory. Durie shows how the Quran positions itself as corrective and final in a revelation to Christianity. That matters deeply for dialogue. It's easy to stop at surface similarities. We both honor Jesus, we both respect Mary, we both believe God works miracles, but the real question is deeper. The question isn't whether Jesus is respected, the question is who Jesus is allowed to be. So in Christianity, Jesus is not merely a messenger pointing away from himself, he is the center of salvation. In Islam, Jesus is honored precisely by being kept within prophetic limits. Those are not the two interpretations of the same foundation. They are two different theological worlds. Now let me press this a little bit further, because this is where people often feel tension. If you're listening and thinking, this feels sharper than polite interfaith dialogue. That reaction makes sense. Clarity and respect are not opposites. Confusion is often more disrespectful than disagreement. The disagreement is not about vocabulary, it's about what kind of divine action is even possible. In Christianity, the claim is shocking. God does not merely send guidance, God comes. God enters history, God suffers, God dies, and God raises again. This is not a small theological move. It redefines power, love, and salvation. Islam cannot accept the claim without undoing its deepest commitment to divine transcendence. This is its stubbornness, its consistency. If God is utterly one and utterly beyond creation, then incarnation is not a mystery to embrace, it's a category error to reject. So the Quran retells the story of Jesus. It isn't correct in history, it's correct in theology. Jesus can be exalted, not enthroned. He can be honored, but not crucified. He can be raised to God, but not raised from the dead as Lord. Once you see that, everything snaps into focus. Repetition, the denials, the boundaries. They are not random. They are structural necessities. Christians must be honest here. We do not honor Jesus by accepting a version of him without the cross. And we do not love Muslim neighbors by pretending these differences don't matter. At the same time, this should humble us. If Christianity is true, salvation does not come from argument. Paul never presents the gospel as advice, he presents it as an announcement. Something has happened. If the problem is forgetfulness, guidance enough. Guidance is enough. If the problem is weakness, discipline is enough. But if the problem is death, only resurrection will do. That's why Jesus sits at the center of the divide. And this is where we need to be very careful, especially if our goal is real engagement rather than a rhetorical victory. Because once you see how carefully the Quran frames Jesus, how consistently it honors him while simultaneously restricting what he can mean, you realize this isn't a misunderstanding that can be cleared up with better wording. It is a fundamentally different story about how God acts. Bannister helps us hear how the story is reinforced through repetition and oral structure, while Durie helps us to see how the story positions itself over against earlier Christian claims. So Christians say Jesus saves, and Muslims say Jesus guides. Those aren't two accents on the same sentence. They are answers to two different diagnoses of the human condition. One assumes humanity needs instruction, the other assumes humanity needs rescue. And that distinction matters pastorally, not just theologically, because people don't come asking for guidance when they're crushed by guilt, shame, or death. They come asking whether anything has actually been done, whether sin has been dealt with, whether death has been defeated, whether hope is grounded in an effort or in an event. Paul's confidence was never in a persuasion alone. It was in proclamation. Something happened. Christ died. Christ was raised. And because of that, again, this is not hypothetical. New life is not aspirational, and resurrection is not symbolic. So we move forward. We keep this in mind. We're not comparing beliefs, We're listening for what each story says about God's willingness to come close, to suffer, and to save. Once you hear those stories clearly, the real question becomes unavoidable. Not which version sounds nicer, but which one tells the truth about the world we actually live in. And that's where honest engagement truly begins.